Tips from Trestle is brought to you by the Belter Companies, Navigator Group Purchasing, and eMenu Choice Point of Sale. Welcome to Tips from Trestle. This podcast is dedicated to discussing the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and leadership. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. As a 25-year veteran of the hospitality industry, I've focused my work on creating exceptional experiences for the customers we serve. My goal for this podcast? Educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living to bring food and hospitality to the front of mind in our industry. Let's bring the innovative and passionate spirit of hospitality to everything that we do for the residents, families, guests, and employees we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm joined by Shane Connor. Shane is the Vice President of Bull Realty's Senior Housing Group, specializing in the acquisition and disposition of institutional quality senior housing and healthcare-related properties with a particular focus on the Southeast. He brings over 10 years of healthcare industry knowledge and has experience investing as well as advising in commercial real estate. His focus is on property types to include age restricted multifamily, independent living, and traditional seniors housing. Shane is deeply passionate about the intersection of real estate, seniors, and healthcare. He holds a BS in finance from King's College and a master's in business and health administration from the University of Scranton. He is also actively involved in both the National Investment Center and the Urban Land Institute. Shane, thanks for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
Yeah, Aaron, great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm excited. You're the first real estate investor type I've had on the podcast, and so I'm very interested to ask you some questions, get a better understanding of what your world is like, and also kind of how it engages with some of the food and hospitality and the things that I focus on and talk a lot about. So, but
yeah,
first,
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, first I'm curious. How did you wind up getting into the senior living part of real estate?
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting winding path. So as you mentioned, I studied finance, came out of school in 2009, bottom of the financial crisis, kind of the worst time to graduate. I did some work in private equity fund accounting, very boring, but learned a lot. Then I worked for my dad's small business for a time. And then I fell into the healthcare recruiting industry in 2012. Had an offer to move down to Atlanta and open up an office for a growing healthcare division of a larger staffing firm. And that was a great ride. Did that from 2012 to 2019. So kind of built our Atlanta office, built our Dallas office, and was selling, healthcare recruiting, staffing, and workforce kind of umbrella of services all over the country and all over the healthcare industry. And part of that did include senior housing, kind of post-acute and that kind of world. I started investing in real estate just on the side, putting, LP checks into kind of multifamily storage and some other asset classes. And then 2019, I had actually left that job, the corporate world, to kind of get into a few different startup ventures. One of them was actually a senior housing skilled nursing component. And then we all know what happened in kind of early 2020. The world came to a halt and threw a lot of those plans upside down and kind of killed them right in their tracks. So at the time, I was kind of looking for my next move, and I was kind of already gone from the job and got introduced to kind of the brokerage and advisory side of the business, and kind of had a light bulb moment to take all of my experience in the healthcare industry and senior housing industry that I have learned, but kind of my new love of real estate and investing and, building relationships, all the stuff I had done in my former life, and kind of combine that to focus on the senior housing industry, which we know is still kind of in the early days of what'll be a 20, 30 year kind of bull run in demographics and all that stuff. So that was kind of how I just started in early 2020 to start building a brokerage and advisory business focused on senior housing.
Yeah, your timing couldn't be better. I mean, when you look at, like you said, the demographics of the
Except
industry,
for COVID. Yeah.
except for COVID, right?
Yeah.
We're gonna just kind of we're gonna talk about
Yeah.
COVID here in a little bit, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, otherwise, like, I mean, it's almost a 45-degree angle on the chart for the
Yeah. It's
demographics.
interesting. I mean, I still think when people ask me, I say like 2028, 2029, end of this decade is when, you really start to see that ramping up. But as I'm sure we'll get into some of the different product categories, you're still seeing those tailwinds start, especially around the active adult and the age restricted, the age restricted multifamily right now. I think assisted living is becoming more clear that that's a healthcare model. The
Mhm.
people are older and sicker and really showing up as a needs based move, later on in life. But yes, when you look at the overall trend of senior housing, the overall supply of units in the market, take aside some of the markets that we've really overbuilt, even then 10, 15 years from now, will probably look underbuilt. And the fact that generally speaking within real estate, multifamily, retail, even hospitality, hotel, I mean, you've got just thousands of brokers, investors, funds. Senior housing is still a smaller world, and
Mhm.
that can be a good and a bad thing. But one of the opportunities I saw was to kind of get in early and really build a brand and reputation around myself and my business.
Yeah, I'm curious your take on this. One of the things that I've always read or I've always heard is that senior housing tends to be, I'm going to say the dreaded R word, recession proof, right? Because there's always going to be a need and always going to be a demand. And as you kind of think about the ebbs and flows of just what you've experienced over the past few years, um, one, is that an accurate statement? And two, how does that kind of lend itself to maybe some of the other trends and conditions you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally true, especially on the assisted living space where it is very needs based. Like,
Mhm.
and I think COVID kind of proved this out. And I'll kind of unpack that a little bit more because basically, although COVID did really disrupt the industry, occupancy kind of nosedived. We literally closed the front doors, no
Mhm.
more move ins, all activity kind of stopped. Occupancy dropped down to like 70, 72%, I think was like the bottom
Yeah.
national baseline. Now, look, I've seen a lot of buildings that are still at 40 or 50% that never kind of recovered. And I've also seen buildings that never dipped below 85 or 90 throughout all of COVID. But as a baseline, a lot of people I talk to actually say COVID kind of validated that overall statement about it being, pretty resistant in that a global pandemic where literally the government said you can't move anyone else in the front door.
Hmm.
Overall, the industry's pretty survived it pretty well now. We're 5 or 6 quarters of occupancy gain in assisted living. I think if we didn't have inflation and interest rate kind of storms on top of coming out of COVID, I
Yeah.
think the recovery would look even better. So generally speaking, I think there is truth to that on the needs based housing, and I call that assisted living, kind of memory care,
Yeah.
maybe throw skilled nursing in there. Lifestyle driven moves, you could probably argue a little less, resistant, being that's a discretionary move. That's a choice based move. Now, I think the worry you have in saying it's fully recession resistant in assisted living is for more of those lower income, middle market, affordable needs that we really need more of. Those people, if they're on fixed incomes and the economy really goes in a nosedive, you may see some more challenges there. But then still, it doesn't replace the fact that they need help, and their family might not be able to give it to them.
Yeah. No, it's funny when you look at that occupancy trend, like it's almost you see like exactly when kind of they let people start opening doors and admitting people back into communities, and you just see it kind of take that upturn, and it's just
Yeah,
been a
it's
steady
I
march.
spoke to a few folks in the lending space, and obviously there's a lot of challenges right now more interest rate driven, I think, and inflation driven with labor and staffing, some of those challenges. But broadly, they were saying over the last 2 or 3 years, it kind of did prove out that it is a very resistant space and the need is clearly there. And I think every year that goes on, because the other thing that people talk about, oh, there's 10,000 baby boomers, turning 65 a day. And they I'm sure you've seen the investment decks and people talk about why they want to get into assisted living. And it's kind of like, that's great. They'll be ready to move into your building in 25 years.
Right.
If the average age is 88 or 89 years old with 3 or 4 comorbidities, they're not really assisted living residents today. It doesn't really matter if they're turning 65. That's great for age restricted multi, active adult, and maybe pure play independent living. So I think the space is very resilient, but I think it's even going to be more resilient 10 years from now. That statement will become even more true as we get further into the bulk of that demographic needing the needs-based housing. Right now, the wave is there, but it's not like it's going to be.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point about the, I guess, the narrative versus the reality of the age of the consumer. Yes.
Which is a big, people are misinformed or misunderstood largely about who the consumer actually is in the different categories of senior housing.
Yeah, no, I think about my in-laws are in their mid 70s. They still own a home. They still go on trip. I mean, they would be perfect for active adult. They're not even anywhere close for assisted living, and they're probably, like you said, 8 or so years away.
A lot of the purpose-built, active adult, you kind of call it different things, 55 plus, active adult, age restricted multi. It's kind of capturing a lot of the same demographic and the consumer preferences that they're looking for. But talking to a lot of those developers and operators, a lot of those residents are in their mid 70s, even upper 70s. You might get a little lower people in their 60s that are still kind of working. But to your point, these people don't view themselves as seniors or needing seniors housing, and they don't want to move into a community. Even if their wing is way over here and the wheelchairs are way over there, it still doesn't compute for them. They don't even think of themselves as wanting to be around that. So I think that's why you're also seeing, the way I described it to somebody this week, I said, what's exciting to me about this industry and this space is I think a lot of the solutions, we don't even know what they look like yet.
Yeah.
They're yet to be developed because we don't know what that consumer is going to want when they're there in 5 or 10 years. Just like I think a lot of the assisted living developers kind of missed the demographic over the last decade and built a lot of what were almost lifestyle driven properties that had, the bistros or the pools. And, it's pretty clear now that you see who's showing up. Again, they're 88, 89, 3 or 4 comorbidities. They're up in their room on medications. They're not swimming in the swimming pool. So I think that divergence will continue. But if you start at, the age restricted space, you have 4 or 5 decades of consumer to kind of move through your continuum. So you could pick a lane and go very narrow and say, look, we're just going to own this segment, or you could develop a broad, continuum of brands and try to kind of own that consumer through the life cycle of their journey from their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s into their 90s.
Yeah, I think the development of like these continuum communities where you have independent living, assisted living, memory care, I think that was maybe some of the thinking behind that. But when I think about the operations piece of that, sometimes it feels very disconnected, almost like we're gonna market and sell independent living to one group, and now we've got this assisted living that we're selling to a different group, and they're not following that kind of continuum mindset, which has always been something that I always had a question mark about in my head. So,
well, and you still have that consumer, just to quickly close that point, to your in-laws, right? If they're who you say they are, right, still live in the home, travel, even if they considered independent living, they don't sound like the type of people that would want to go into a traditional garden style building that had even if it was very heavy IL, but they're walking in the same entrance as the AL and memory care, that's not going to compute in their mind as a consumer.
Definitely. No, you're spot on with that. So today I want to tell you about one of Trustful's senior living partners, Belter. Belter is a food service design, equipment, and supply company that has been providing expert guidance to the food and beverage industry for nearly a century. A strategic partner to the most successful food service operations in the country, Belter provides support in kitchen and bar design, equipment procurement and install, and supplies. Their team of senior living food service experts have experience across the continuum of care. From independent living to skilled nursing and CCRCs, Belter specializes in right-sizing new facilities, modernizing remodels, and providing the right food service equipment and supplies. At Belter, they are committed to creating memorable experiences for their customers and their guests. With their top-notch team and a global network of quality supplier partners, their customer-focused approach is built on a foundation of collaboration and decades of industry experience. So thank you for considering Belter for all of your food service needs. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, you'd mentioned COVID and I said we'd get to that. One of the things that I experienced both on the operator side and even now in the consulting work I do is that more and more of these owners and investment groups are starting to get more hands-on and more detailed in operations and wanting to not just get the weekly and monthly reports, but they want the data, they want to see it, they want to be able to have their own kind of internal decision makers reviewing and being able to kind of understand what's going. From your vantage point, is this something that's just left over from COVID and will eventually go away, or do you think this is something that's going to be here to stay in the long run?
I think it's here for the long run. I think it's driven from a few different angles, and maybe I'll try to touch on them. First and foremost, I do think vertical integration is the way to go moving forward. I mean, if I could paint the perfect organization, right, they could develop it, they could own it, they could operate it, all under the same organization. Even if those are segmented divisions or
Right.
what have you, they're going to know best kind of how to have that community perform and have that asset perform from a financial perspective. I think COVID definitely was kind of a lightning rod in kind of the divergence of the capital that's looking for either partner with good operators from a joint venture perspective to try to buy and integrate their own operation platforms, or just looking a lot harder on kind of who the operators are and kind of picking their favorite horses and financially backing them. I think some of that came from, in multifamily, you have a lot more just third-party management companies, right? They're not to downplay the importance of the work they do, but they're certainly more plentiful in multifamily, market rate multifamily, than they are in senior housing. And I'm talking senior housing and assisted living, memory care, right? Yeah. It's really an operations, complex small business with a real estate component. As you had some of these groups growing and they were doing a lot of third-party management, and then maybe they bought a couple of their own buildings. So now they're, an owner and an operator on a few communities, and they've got a whole portfolio of where they're just fee-based third-party, call it 5% off the top. Something like COVID hits, it's kind of hard for those, executives and the leadership team to kind of tell you, an asset manager or an owner, that, look, we're on it, we've got our best team on it, when they just get 5% of revenue from your building, but they own buildings over here. Maybe they've signed personal recourse debt, right?
Yep.
And it's just human nature. Where are they going to put their most valuable resources and devote most of their time? And I think the banks started to kind of see some of that. And so now I'm hearing and seeing when deals are coming together, right? They want to know not only who's the operator, but like what's their skin in the game. And now you're seeing people get creative with that, where it's maybe offering them some ownership stake, or they're having to co-invest some degree of skin in the game, just so that we're further kind of aligning those incentives to make sure that, when times are good, we're sharing in it. And when times are tough, right, we're kind of sharing in that as well. And so I think as more and more capital comes into this space, new private equity funds, other asset class groups that are looking to come into senior housing, they're finding out very quickly that the operator is really the key, and the right operator is really the key. And so I think moving forward, the operators are holding a lot of the leverage in this business. And you're going to see a lot of, smart money and smart operators aligning, integrating, so on and so forth. But I think in a long-winded way, yeah, COVID really kind of blew open the doors on some of the misalignment that you may have had just by nature of how the industry evolved.
Yeah, it felt to me like it was coming, but COVID like fast tracked all of it. And so,
Right.
The vertical integration you mentioned, do you think that allows them some flexibility with margins and some of the those key KPIs they have to manage because it's all under that one roof, so to speak?
Navigator is the largest full-service GPO that exclusively focuses on the senior living community. And what that means is we provide products and services that help our members provide a great environment for their residents, such as like MRO, hospitality equipment, food, business products, as well as technology solutions. We actually surround our members with a level of support unmatched in the industry.
Yeah, I think you can certainly get, you can probably drive some more efficiencies that are going to move that margin. Even if you have competing motives internally in an organization, if you're all under the same umbrella, leadership can potentially further align that mission, and maybe that helps you make certain decisions that are maybe going to be tougher financially in the short term, but over the long term are going to benefit everything. Whereas if you're just, an IRR driven fund that has a 3 to 5 year life cycle on that asset, you're wanting certain decisions that may be in conflict with what the operator is telling you needs to be done, for the best current situation on the ground with the residents or the CapEx or what have you. So I just think the closer you can align all the different motives and incentives of organizations, ultimately it's going to be a better experience for the resident. And frankly, when people ask me now, like just everyday people in my life that know I'm in senior housing and senior living, and ask, what should we do if we're looking to shop for mom or dad? One of the questions I tell them to ask now is like, ask them about the ownership structure. Like who owns it? Are they publicly traded? Are they privately traded? Are they integrated? Like just see what even answers you get, and then come back and we could talk about it, because I think it will make a difference moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on with that, and clearly you have a little more thumb on the pulse of that than I do. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, I feel like if I don't ask you about the food and engagement aspects of a community from an investor's perspective, I'm going to be missing a mark here. But with kind of knowing how investors look at properties, why should operators focus more time and energy, and maybe even whether it's time resources or money resources, on improving those food and engagement aspects of their properties?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great point, and I think you could tie it back to COVID again if you want. And the line I'm drawing there is just that I think coming out of that period and this period, you're having a more engaged consumer, a more savvy consumer, whether that's the resident themselves or the adult children, kind of helping to make that decision. If they're looking at 4 or 5 different options in a market, right, they're going to be looking at what technology do they have in the building, what other differentiators, and then, food, right? If you show up and you get the feeling at 1 or 2 communities that food is just kind of an afterthought, like, yeah, it's the standard food program, it's blah, blah, blah. And maybe you walk into one and there's just a totally different feeling of like the food is the forefront. The food is the most important thing, because we know food is everything in life, right? Yeah. And especially as you age and maybe you're slipping further into Alzheimer's and dementia, senses are still alive in people. And, I remember when my dad was losing the end of his life in the hospital, right? All he wanted was for us to bring him good food from outside the hospital because he couldn't stand the food
Yeah.
that they were bringing anymore. So I think, savvier consumers coming up that are going to have more options. And as we build these markets and we do get density of beds in a certain market, and you have to really start trying to compare apples to apples, whereas before it was kind of like, well, it is what it is. We don't really have a choice. We just need to move mom into the community. I think food could be something you could really market yourself on. I know like Lowe out in Dallas with Sage Oak, really makes that a cornerstone of his marketing with the open kitchen concept, and the fact that, they really upplay the food. And look, I've eaten food at a lot of different communities as I've toured, and some of it's pretty good and some of it's, I ate it, but I wouldn't eat it again.
Exactly. Like, not again.
Right. So I think the way I would look at it is it's another sales tool and marketing tool that you are going to have to differentiate yourself. You can't just say, if you build it, they will come. I think that did work for a lot of the last 2 decades, but I think moving forward, especially in competitive markets, you're going to really have to showcase why you're different in a lot of different ways. And I think food is an easy one to try to elevate, because you're serving it multiple times a day, and it's going to be a focal point. That dining areas where people are coming together and congregating. People don't want to do that over crappy food.
Yeah, no. And, you're so spot on, because I talk to operators and tell them, look, it's 3 touch points a day. Like, where else in the community do you think you're going to guarantee that many times you're going to interact with the resident? So,
negative or positive. Like, if somebody
Exactly.
really doesn't like the food and they feel like their children moved them in there against their will, and they're pissed off and they're eating crappy food, compare that to just, if you could just elevate that experience, how different that would be. They would tell their friends to move into the community. That's going to drive occupancy. So I think it's like a lot of different things. It's all how you view it. You could just view it as an expense and a line item and a necessary, or you could view it as a referral engine. If we have the best food in town, people are going to talk about it. That's going to drive referrals. That's going to drive occupancy. That's going to drive valuation. So you could argue having a good food program is worth millions of dollars.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Something that I generally feel that, when we're talking about food programs and engagement programs, that it's an expense, right? We've got to do it because the regulations say we have to do it, but there's so much value that could be taken from it that if it's done right and done well, it will sell a community and keep it full.
Right. And I think there was something Bob Kramer of Nick had said at the last conference. We were doing a session, and it was something to the effect of that you have to realize these people are slowly losing all of their freedoms. And there's a real kind of struggle to that process for people. And so if you have moved in and you're coming to terms with the fact that you're now in an assisted living community, and you're really aging, and you're facing your own mortality and all these things that a lot of these residents are having to go through, food is such an easy one, right? To try to elevate and make sure that, okay, I've lost all these other things, but at least I still have good food, right?
Yeah. And even choice with food, right? That's one of the things that I would always tell my chefs is, look, like you just said, they are here for reasons that they can't control a lot of times. And so let's try and give them choice where you can. And the menus.
If they don't want to be there and they want to leave, don't make them feel like they're in prison too, getting 3 square a day.
Exactly.
Here's your option. Here's your food.
Exactly. So Shane, as we kind of come towards the end of our time here, I wanted you to, I follow you on Twitter, and I see you got some really great insights on the market and things you see. So I'm going to ask you to kind of look into your crystal ball and kind of tell the listeners, what are the 1 or 2 kind of either low key or unseen opportunities in the senior living space that you are seeing currently, and maybe over the next, 3 to 5 years?
So there's probably two that kind of stick out. One would be co-locating senior housing and medical offices. So not just, co-locating them like close to each other or within the same kind of mixed use, but like literally you're going to develop a senior housing community and it will be essentially attached or joined at least very, very closely and operate it very, very closely with one another. And that kind of provides, a synergy and a self-fulfilling loop kind of between the two.
Yeah.
Because the medical office is going to benefit from obviously having, and depends on what's in there, what specialties, is it primary care, is it orthopedics, imaging, whatever. You've kind of got this baked in, ecosystem of potential patient base, but then also for the senior living community as a marketing tool and driving move-ins, right? Again, if I'm shopping, there's 3 or 4 communities in a market, and 2 over here are 3 or 4 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile from the medical offices in the area. And this one, literally, they can walk down the hallway and across, the bridgeway or the parking lot. That's going to drive referrals and move-ins, and it's kind of going to be a self-fulfilling loop. And so we haven't seen too much of that development yet. I know one group in particular who's doing it pretty well, and I'm excited to kind of watch them continue. I think more people will come onto that trend.
Yeah.
And then second, an area I'm spending a lot of time personally focused and energy and work in is purpose-built for rent, age restricted, active adult communities, but in the housing. So, build for rent is gotten very big, right? Mm-hmm. And these are just like developments that are single family homes for rent, townhomes for rent. But you haven't seen as many that are age restricted and purposely kind of designed and built for senior housing. We're starting to see it now. There could be maybe 20 or 30 of these in the whole country that are recently kind of designed and purpose built and operated. And what you're doing is taking everything that we've seen in active adult apartments that have come out of the ground in the last 5 or 10 years, and we know what works and we know what those consumers are looking for, right? They're probably in their 60s, 70s, economic mobility. They want to rent, they want flexibility, they want to live amongst their peers, they want some wellness, they want that programming and activation of the community. But there's a lot of people that don't want that in an apartment. Like maybe they've never lived in an apartment, or they haven't done it since they were in college. And so now this is a blending of those two, and you're having these larger sites, these 15, 20, 30 acre sites. You have to be a little more suburban and a little more exfil, obviously, to get that kind of acreage, but you have, 100, 200 detached villas, bungalows, cottages, whatever you want to call them, with a clubhouse, walking trails, and all those elements that active adult apartments have captured, kind of deploying them into a more home setting. Your zero entry showers, raised outlets, some aging in place elements, but these are still very independent people that don't view themselves as senior housing, but they're ready to kind of move on and maybe get rid of the primary home they've lived in. And this is kind of that next chapter in their life, and they could stay there for 5 or 10 years. So, when people say 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day, that's the segment that I now click in my head. The light bulb is the runway there, and we're just tip of the spear for a lot of that product.
Wow. Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought of that. And I think that makes perfect sense. So, well, Shane, this has been a great conversation.
That's been fun.
I've probably learned more about senior real estate in the last 30 minutes than the last 15 years in the industry. So I appreciate your insight and knowledge. So what's the best way for listeners to connect with you or learn more about you and Bull Realty?
So, you mentioned Twitter. I know you're on there. I spend a good amount of time on Twitter. There's a great real estate community there. A few of us in senior housing, but growing. LinkedIn. I'm on there as well, posting content. So just DM me, email me, Shane at bullrealty.com. Based here in Atlanta, traveling to a lot of conferences this year, be at Nick again, heading to Toronto next month for the Urban Land Institute conference. So if anybody out there is going to those and they'd like to schedule some time, just reach out to me.
Sounds good. Well, Shane, I appreciate all your time this morning, and thanks for joining us today on Tips from Trestle.
Been a pleasure, Aaron. Thanks for doing it.
So there you have it, another one in the books. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.